In 1975, Jimmy Hoffa walked into a restaurant parking lot and vanished from the face of the earth. The man who claimed to know what happened was a soft-spoken truck driver named Frank Sheeran, the Irishman who confessed to 25 murders before his death. This is not a story of movie magic or Hollywood invention. This is the true account of three men whose lives intersected at the bloodiest crossroads of American organized crime: Frank the Irishman Sheeran, Russell Bufalino, and Jimmy Hoffa. Picture America in the summer of 1975. The Vietnam War had just ended in chaotic defeat. Richard Nixon had resigned in disgrace less than a year earlier. The country was reeling, uncertain, looking for stability in institutions it once trusted. And on a hot July afternoon in suburban Detroit, one of the most powerful labor leaders in American history simply disappeared, leaving behind only questions that would haunt investigators for half a century. The parking lot of the Marshu's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, Michigan, sits quiet now. Just another strip mall location where ordinary people go about ordinary lives. But on July 30th, 1975, it became the site of one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. Or perhaps it was solved by a dying man in a nursing home, unburdening his soul to a curious lawyer who would write it all down in a book called I Heard You Paint Houses. This is a story about loyalty and betrayal, about power and its terrible price, about men who lived by a code that demanded everything and promised nothing but an early grave or a lonely cell. It's about the American underworld at the height of its influence, when mobsters could make presidents and break unions, when a whisper from the right dome could redirect millions of dollars, when a truck driver from Philadelphia could become one of the most feared killers in the mob. Before we dive into one of the most fascinating true crime stories of the 20th century, let us know, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Drop a comment below. If you love deep dive true crime and mob history, hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you never miss a story. Give us a like if you're ready for this journey, and share this with anyone who loves real gangster history. Now, let's begin at the beginning, with a boy from Philadelphia who would grow up to paint houses. Francis Joseph Sheeran was born on October 25, 1920, in Darby, Pennsylvania, a working-class suburb of Philadelphia, where Irish immigrants had settled in waves throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His father, Thomas Sheeran, worked with his hands, as did most men in their neighborhood. His mother, Mary, kept house and raised children in the manner expected of Irish Catholic women of her generation. Frank was one of several children, growing up in a household where money was tight, expectations were clear, and the future seemed predetermined. You worked hard. You stayed out of trouble. You provided for your family. The neighborhood where Frank grew up was a patchwork of ethnic enclaves. The Irish stuck together, as did the Italians, the Poles, the Germans. Each group brought its own traditions, its own way of seeing the world, its own code of conduct. For young Frank, the Irish code was simple: loyalty to family, loyalty to friends, and a willingness to stand your ground when challenged. In the streets and schoolyards of Darby, boys learned early that respect came from strength, and strength meant you didn't back down from a fight. Frank was tall for his age, with striking blue eyes and a calm demeanor that belied an inner toughness. He wasn't a bully, but he wasn't someone you wanted to cross, even as a boy. He had a quality that would serve him throughout his life: an ability to remain still and quiet while others talked, to observe before acting, to let his actions speak louder than his words. In the world he would eventually enter, these qualities would make him invaluable. The Great Depression hit the Sheeran family hard, as it did everyone in their neighborhood. Frank watched his father struggle to find work, watched his mother stretch pennies to feed hungry children. He learned that life was unfair, that hard work didn't always pay off, that sometimes good people suffered through no fault of their own. These lessons would shape his worldview. The system was rigged. The powerful took what they wanted, and if you wanted to survive, you had to be willing to bend the rules. As a teenager, Frank worked odd jobs to help his family. He delivered groceries, worked in factories, did whatever was needed. He was reliable, punctual, and strong, qualities that employers valued. But he was also watching the neighborhood around him. Seeing how things really worked, he noticed the bookies taking bets, the loan sharks collecting debts, the guys who always seemed to have money, even when everyone else was broke. He noticed that these men commanded respect, that people stepped aside when they walked down the street, that cops seemed to look the other way. But Frank wasn't looking to become a gangster. Yet, he was just a working-class kid trying to help his family get by. Then came December 7th, 1941, and everything changed. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and America went to war. Frank was 21 years old, and like millions of other young men, he enlisted. He joined the army, went through basic training, and shipped out to Europe as part of the massive buildup for the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. World War II transformed Frank Sheeran in ways he would never fully articulate, but that everyone who knew him would recognize. He landed with the 45th Infantry Division in Italy in 1943, part of the brutal Italian campaign that saw some of the fiercest fighting of the war. The 45th Infantry, known as the Thunderbirds, fought their way up the Italian peninsula, engaging in brutal combat against entrenched German forces. Frank saw his first combat in Sicily, and what he experienced there would haunt him for the rest of his life, and prepare him for the life he would lead afterward. In combat, Frank discovered something about himself. He could kill without hesitation, without the paralysis that overcame some men when bullets started flying, when his unit came under fire, when the order came to advance or to hold or to take that hill or that building. Frank did what needed to be done. He was awarded the Bronze Star for his actions in combat, though he rarely spoke about what he did to earn it. In later years, when Charles Brandt asked him about the war, Frank would say simply that he did his job, that he followed orders, that war was hell and he survived it. But there was more to it than that. In Italy and later in France and Germany, Frank participated in operations that went beyond conventional combat. He was part of units that conducted special operations, that went behind enemy lines, that eliminated specific targets. The Army recognized that Frank had a particular skill set. He could follow orders without question, could kill without moral crisis, could keep secrets in the chaos of war. These qualities made him valuable. In the underworld he would later enter, they would make him indispensable. The 45th Infantry participated in the liberation of Dachau concentration camp in April 1945. What Frank saw there stayed with him forever. He saw the ovens, the mass graves, the walking skeletons barely alive. He saw what human beings were capable of doing to other human beings when they had absolute power and no accountability. Some men might have emerged from that experience with a renewed commitment to human dignity and the rule of law. Frank emerged with a different lesson. The world was a brutal place, and the strong did what they wanted to the weak. All that mattered was which side you were on. Frank returned to Philadelphia in late 1945, a decorated combat veteran with skills that had no obvious application in civilian life. He was 25 years old, and like millions of other returning servicemen, he needed to find his place in a peacetime America that felt strange and unfamiliar after years of war. He married Mary Leddy, an Irish girl from the neighborhood, and started a family. He needed work, steady work that could support a wife and the children that would come. Someone suggested trucking. The late 1940s were boom times for trucking in America. The war had demonstrated the importance of a robust transportation network, and the post-war economy was expanding rapidly. Goods needed to move from factories to warehouses to stores, and trucks were the way to move them. Frank got his commercial driver's license and started driving delivery trucks for a food service company. The work was hard, long hours, heavy lifting, navigating traffic and weather. But Frank didn't mind hard work. He'd survived the war. He could handle anything. What Frank didn't know, but quickly learned, was that the trucking industry in Philadelphia and across much of America was controlled by two overlapping power structures: the Teamsters Union and organized crime. The Teamsters, officially the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, Chauffeurs, Warehousemen, and Helpers of America, was one of the most powerful unions in the country. If you wanted to drive a truck professionally, you joined the Teamsters. If you wanted your goods delivered, you dealt with the Teamsters. And if you wanted the Teamsters to work with you instead of against you, you dealt with the men who really controlled the union, the mob. Frank's introduction to organized crime came through meat. He was driving refrigerated trucks, carrying meat from suppliers to butcher shops and restaurants. It was valuable cargo, easily sold, and the trucks were targets for hijackers. At first, Frank did what he was supposed to do. He tried to protect his cargo, reported thefts to his employer and the police, and followed the rules. But he noticed something odd. Sometimes, trucks were hijacked and the drivers weren't hurt. In fact, they were told exactly where to stop, exactly when to take their break, exactly how to make it easy for the hijackers. And those drivers seemed to do just fine afterward. They kept their jobs, kept driving, and nobody called them cowards for not fighting back. Frank figured it out quickly enough. The hijackings were inside jobs, organized by members of the Philadelphia mob in cooperation with corrupt Teamsters officials. The drivers who played along got a cut and kept their jobs. The drivers who didn't play along might find themselves in the hospital, or worse. Frank was a practical man. He had a wife and children to support. When the approach came, and it always came for drivers carrying valuable cargo, Frank listened. The man who approached Frank was a Teamsters official named Frank Sheeran. Wait, that needs clarification. Frank Sheeran, the truck driver, met men connected to Angelo Bruno, the boss of the Philadelphia crime family. Bruno was known as the Gentle Don, a soft-spoken man who preferred negotiation to violence, business to bloodshed. But make no mistake, Bruno was a made member of La Cosa Nostra, with all the power and connections that entailed. The men who worked for Bruno approached Frank Sheeran because they'd heard he was a stand-up guy, a combat veteran who could be trusted. They offered Frank a simple proposition. Occasionally, his truck would be hijacked. Frank would follow instructions, make it easy, and wouldn't ask questions. In exchange, Frank would receive cash payments and the protection of the Bruno family. If he had any problems with his employer, with the union, with competitors, with anyone, he would have powerful friends who could solve those problems. And if he proved reliable, there might be other opportunities. Frank said yes. It wasn't a difficult decision. He'd seen enough of the world to know that nobody succeeded by following the rules. The people who made the rules, who enforced the rules, who preached about law and order, they were all corrupt in their own ways. At least the mob was honest about what it was. They didn't pretend to be anything but criminals. They had a code, and they kept their word. That meant something to Frank. The hijackings went smoothly. Frank did what he was told, asked no questions, kept his mouth shut. The cash payments helped with the bills and made life a little easier for his growing family. Frank and Mary would eventually have 4 daughters, and Frank was determined to give them a better life than he'd had. The extra money from the mob helped with that. And Frank discovered that he had a reputation now. In the warehouses and loading docks, Among the other drivers and the Teamsters officials, people knew that Frank Sheeran was connected, that he was protected, that he was someone to respect. But the real turning point came in 1955, when Frank Sheeran met Russell Bufalino. This meeting, arranged by mutual associates in Philadelphia, would change Frank's life forever and set in motion a chain of events that would lead directly to that parking lot in Detroit 20 years later. Russell Bufalino was unlike anyone Frank had met before. He wasn't loud or flashy like some mob guys. He didn't dress in expensive suits or drive fancy cars. He looked like a prosperous small-town businessman, which in a way, he was. But Russell Bufalino was also one of the most powerful organized crime figures in America. A man whose influence reached from Pennsylvania to Florida to Cuba. A man who sat on the commission that governed La Cosa Nostra. A man whose word could mean life or death. Russell was born in Sicily in 1903 and came to America as a child. He grew up in Buffalo, New York, learning the ways of the American mob from men who had learned them in the old country. He was smart, patient, and absolutely ruthless when necessary. By the 1950s, he was the boss of the northeastern Pennsylvania crime family, based in the small city of Pittston, tucked away in the anthracite coal region. It was an unlikely location for a major mob power base, but Russell had made it work. He controlled labor unions, including the Teamsters. He controlled politicians and judges. He controlled legitimate businesses and illegal rackets, and he did it all quietly, without attracting the attention that plagued the more famous New York families. Russell and Frank connected immediately. They were both men of few words. Both men who valued loyalty above all else. Both men who understood that the old ways, the ways of respect and honor and keeping your mouth shut, were the only ways that mattered. Russell saw in Frank something he could use. A reliable man. A tough man. A man who could follow orders and keep secrets. Frank saw in Russell something he'd been looking for. A mentor. A protector. A father figure who could guide him in this new world he'd entered. Russell offered Frank a job. Not driving trucks. Russell had bigger plans. He wanted Frank to work directly for him, to be his representative in various business dealings, to handle problems that required a certain kind of solution. The pay would be good, better than Frank could make driving trucks. And there would be opportunities for advancement if Frank proved himself. Russell spoke carefully, never quite saying explicitly what he meant, but Frank understood. Russell was offering him a position as an enforcer, a problem solver, a man who would do whatever needed to be done. Frank accepted. His days as a truck driver were over. Now he was a made associate of the Bufalino crime family, a man with connections, a man with power, a man who mattered. He was 35 years old, and he had found his calling. Over the next few years, Frank would prove himself to Russell again and again. When someone needed to be convinced to pay a debt, Frank convinced them. When someone needed to be taught a lesson, Frank taught them. When someone needed to disappear, Frank made them disappear. He was good at it. The skills he'd learned in World War II, the ability to kill without hesitation, to follow orders without question, to keep secrets no matter what, served him perfectly in his new profession. But Frank wasn't just a mindless killer. He was intelligent, observant, and careful. He planned his jobs meticulously. He left no evidence. He had alibis. And most importantly, he never, ever talked about what he did. This last quality made him invaluable in a world where most men eventually betrayed their friends to save themselves. Russell Bufalino came to trust Frank Sheeran completely. And in the world of La Cosa Nostra, trust was more valuable than gold. Russell began taking Frank with him to meetings, introducing him to other powerful mob figures, bringing him into situations that required absolute discretion. Frank met Carlo Gambino, the boss of bosses in New York. He met Santo Trafficante, who controlled Florida and had connections in Cuba. He met men whose names would later become famous through Senate hearings and FBI investigations. Men who were shaping American history from the shadows. And in 1957, Russell Bufalino introduced Frank Sheeran to Jimmy Hoffa, the most powerful labor leader in America. This introduction would prove to be the most important of Frank's life. It would bring him money, power, and influence beyond anything he'd imagined. It would also lead him to commit the act that would define his legacy, the murder of the man who had become his friend. To understand what happened to Jimmy Hoffa, you must first understand Russell Bufalino. Of all the mob bosses who dominated Americanized crime in the mid-20th century, Russell was perhaps the most effective precisely because he was the least known. While Sam Giancana courted celebrities in Las Vegas and Carlo Gambino dealt with constant law enforcement scrutiny in New York, Russell Bufalino ran his operations from Pittston, Pennsylvania, a small city of barely 50,000 people nestled in the Wyoming Valley, a region known more for coal mining than for crime. But Russell's power was real and far-reaching. He controlled the Teamsters locals in northeastern Pennsylvania. He had interests in legitimate businesses, garment factories, coal companies, labor contracting firms. He had interests in illegal enterprises, gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering. He had political connections at every level, from local judges to state legislators to, according to some accounts, the White House itself. And he had something that many bigger, more famous mob bosses lacked: discipline and discretion. Russell Bufalino was born in Monte d'Oro, Sicily, in 1903. His family immigrated to the United States when he was a child, settling first in Buffalo, New York, where Russell grew up in the city's Italian immigrant community. Buffalo in the early 20th century was a major industrial center, and like most industrial cities, it had a thriving organized crime presence. The Buffalo Mob was part of the Commission, the ruling body of La Cosa Nostra in America. And young Russell learned the business from men who had brought the old Sicilian traditions to the New World. The old traditions emphasized certain values that Russell would carry throughout his life. First, omerta, the code of silence. You never spoke to outsiders about the business. You never testified in court. You never cooperated with law enforcement. No matter what they offered you, no matter what they threatened, breaking omerta meant death. And not just for you. Your family could be killed. Your friends could be killed. Everyone you cared about could pay the price for your betrayal. Second, respect for hierarchy. The mob was not a democracy. There was a boss, an underboss, consigliere. Captains, soldiers, and associates. Orders flowed down. Money flowed up. You respected the men above you. And you demanded respect from the men below you. You didn't challenge authority unless you were prepared to back up the challenge with violence. And even then, you needed approval from the Commission. Third, the importance of earning. Everyone had to earn, had to bring money into the family, whether through legitimate businesses or illegal rackets. You were expected to generate income. Some of that income went to your boss as tribute. This was how the system worked. In exchange for paying tribute, you received protection and the right to use the family name when doing business. Fourth, the sanctity of the family. Not your blood family, though that mattered too, but your crime family. These were your brothers. Bound by oath and blood, you would kill for them, die for them, go to prison for them. This bond was supposed to be unbreakable. In practice, of course, men betrayed each other constantly, which is why trust was so valuable, and why men like Frank Sheeran, who never broke their word, rose to positions of power. Russell absorbed these lessons and applied them with remarkable success. By the late 1920s, he was working for the Buffalo Mob, running various rackets and proving himself reliable. In 1940, he moved to Pittston, Pennsylvania, his wife's hometown, and began building what would become one of the most powerful crime families in America. Northeastern Pennsylvania might have seemed an unlikely base of operations, but Russell saw its advantages. First, it was away from the constant attention that plagued the New York families. The FBI focused its resources on New York. Chicago, Las Vegas, the obvious centers of mob power. Small cities like Pittston flew under the radar, allowing Russell to operate with relative freedom. Second, the region had industries that the mob could exploit. The coal mines employed thousands of workers, all of them represented by unions that could be corrupted and controlled. The garment industry was moving from New York to Pennsylvania, seeking cheaper labor and fewer union problems. Problems that Russell could either solve or create, depending on what benefited him. Third, the region was strategically located. Northeastern Pennsylvania sits between New York and Philadelphia to the south, and Buffalo and Cleveland to the north and west. Interstate highways were being built, making the region a transportation hub. This was important for the mob's various enterprises, from moving stolen goods to transporting illegal gambling proceeds to smuggling contraband. Russell built his power base methodically. He cultivated relationships with local politicians, contributing to campaigns and ensuring that friendly faces occupied key positions. He developed relationships with local law enforcement, making sure that certain activities were overlooked in exchange for cooperation on others. He invested in legitimate businesses, creating sources of legal income that could be reported on tax returns and used to explain his comfortable lifestyle. But the real key to Russell's power was the Teamsters. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters was growing rapidly in the post-war years, and it was increasingly falling under mob control. Teamsters locals were perfect vehicles for corruption. They controlled who worked and who didn't in the trucking industry. They controlled pension funds worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They had political influence, as politicians courted union endorsements, and they could be used to extort legitimate businesses through the threat of strikes, slowdowns, and labor troubles. Russell gained control of several Teamsters locals in northeastern Pennsylvania. This gave him leverage over trucking companies, which needed peaceful labor relations to operate profitably. It also gave him access to the Teamsters pension funds, which could be used to make loans, often at extortionate rates, to businesses that needed capital, and it connected him to the national Teamsters leadership, particularly to a rising star from Detroit named Jimmy Hoffa. By the early 1950s, Russell Bufalino was a made member of La Cosa Nostra and the recognized boss of the northeastern Pennsylvania family. He attended mob meetings and sit-downs. He was consulted on major decisions. He sat on the commission, the ruling body that settled disputes between families and made policy for the entire organization. For a boss from such a small city, this was unusual, and it spoke to Russell's intelligence, his diplomatic skills, and the respect he commanded. Russell's relationship with the commission was complicated. The commission was dominated by the 5 families of New York: Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno, along with representatives from Chicago, Buffalo, and a few other major cities. These were the glamorous families, the ones that got attention, the ones that controlled the most lucrative rackets. Russell's family was much smaller, but it was also more stable, more disciplined, and more profitable relative to its size. The New York families were constantly at war with each other, constantly dealing with internal betrayals, constantly facing prosecution. Russell's family had none of these problems. His men were loyal, his operations were discreet, and he avoided the kind of flashy violence that attracted FBI attention. When disputes arose, Russell was often called in as a mediator, as someone both sides could trust to be fair. This made him invaluable, and it protected him. As long as he was useful to the commission, he was safe. Russell's diplomatic skills were legendary. He could sit in a room with men who hated each other and broker peace. He could negotiate complex business deals that satisfied all parties. He could resolve disputes without bloodshed, which saved everyone money and trouble. But when diplomacy failed, Russell could be ruthless. Men who crossed him disappeared. Witnesses who might testify against him had accidents. Russell understood that respect came from two sources: the ability to make peace and the ability to make war. He was skilled at both. One of Russell's most important relationships was with Santo Trafficante Jr., the boss of the Tampa crime family, who controlled much of Florida and had extensive interests in Cuba before Castro's revolution. Trafficante was sophisticated, intelligent, and internationally connected. He and Russell worked together on various schemes. From drug smuggling to casino operations to political corruption, they trusted each other, which was rare in the mob world. And that trust allowed them to make millions together. Russell's connections extended beyond the traditional mob. He had relationships with corrupt politicians at the state and federal level. He had relationships with corrupt union officials in multiple industries. He had relationships with legitimate businessmen who were willing to work with the mob when it served their interests. This network of relationships was Russell's real power. He wasn't just a gangster. He was a power broker, a man who could make things happen or stop them from happening. And then there was Russell's relationship with Frank Sheeran. Of all the men who worked for Russell over the years, Frank was special. Russell trusted Frank completely, which he never did with anyone else. He brought Frank into his home, made him part of family celebrations, confided in him about business matters. When Russell needed something done, something sensitive, something that required absolute discretion, he called Frank, and Frank never failed him. Russell and Frank became genuine friends. As much as such a relationship was possible in their world, they spent time together socially, not just on business. They took trips together, they shared meals. Russell's wife, Carrie, became close with Frank's wife, Mary. The two couples vacationed together, attended each other's family events. For Frank, who had grown up poor and directionless, Russell became the father figure he'd never had. For Russell, who had no sons, Frank became the son he'd never had, tough, loyal, reliable. But their relationship was always grounded in business. Russell didn't maintain friendships purely for emotional satisfaction. Every relationship had to serve a purpose, had to generate value. Frank's value was obvious. He was an enforcer, a killer, a man who could solve problems that couldn't be solved through negotiation or bribery. Russell had used violence himself when he was younger, but as he aged and his responsibilities increased, he needed men like Frank to do that work for him. The structure of Russell's operation was typical of mob families, but adapted to his specific situation. As boss, Russell made all major decisions and received tribute from all the family's operations. His underboss handled day-to-day operations and supervised the captains. The captains each controlled a crew of soldiers and associates who ran specific rackets. Gambling in this territory, loan sharking in that one, labor racketeering in another. Associates like Frank weren't made members of La Cosa Nostra. You had to be full-blooded Italian to be made, but they could be just as important and just as well compensated. Russell's family generated income from numerous sources. Gambling was always lucrative. Numbers games, sports betting, dice games, card games. The house always took a percentage, and the volume was substantial. Loan sharking was even more profitable. Borrowers who couldn't get legitimate loans came to mob loan sharks, who charged exorbitant interest rates and used violence to ensure repayment. Labor racketeering was perhaps the most sophisticated operation. By controlling union locals, Russell could extort businesses, manipulate labor contracts, and skim from union pension funds. The Teamsters Pension Fund was particularly important. The fund held hundreds of millions of dollars in assets, money that was supposed to provide retirement security for union members. But the fund was controlled by corrupt officials who could be influenced by the mob. Russell and other mob bosses used the pension fund as a bank, making loans to businesses they controlled or to businesses that paid kickbacks for access to capital. These loans were often never repaid, and the pension fund absorbed the losses. The scheme went on for decades, costing union members hundreds of millions in lost retirement benefits. Russell also invested in legitimate businesses, partly to launder money and partly because legitimate businesses were genuinely profitable. He had interests in garment manufacturing, coal distribution, vending machine companies, and real estate. These businesses provided legal income that justified his lifestyle and gave him influence in the legitimate business community. Some of Russell's business partners had no idea they were working with a mob boss. He presented himself as a successful businessman, and on paper, that's exactly what he was. But underneath the legitimate facade was always the threat of violence. Russell didn't use violence casually. He wasn't like some mob bosses who killed people over minor insults or perceived disrespect. He was too smart for that. Violence attracted attention, created enemies, and cost money. But when violence was necessary, Russell didn't hesitate, and when he ordered a hit, he used men like Frank Sheeran to carry it out. Frank was Russell's weapon, his instrument of last resort, the solution to problems that couldn't be solved any other way. By the late 1950s, Russell Bufalino had everything he wanted: money, power, respect, and the wisdom to hold on to all three. He lived comfortably, but not ostentatiously in Pittston. He traveled when he wanted, conducting business in New York, Miami, Las Vegas. Wherever his interests took him, he had survived decades in a business where most men died young or spent their lives in prison. And he had cultivated a relationship with the man who would become the most powerful labor leader in American history. A man whose friendship would make Russell even richer and more influential. A man whose eventual betrayal would require the ultimate sanction. That man was Jimmy Hoffa. And understanding Russell Bufalino's relationship with Hoffa is essential to understanding what happened in that parking lot in 1975. Russell didn't order hits lightly. He wasn't impulsive or emotional. When he decided that Jimmy Hoffa had to die, it was a business decision, made reluctantly, but with absolute certainty. And when Russell Bufalino made a decision like that, it was carried out with precision and finality. The man he trusted to carry out that decision was Frank Sheeran, his friend, his most reliable soldier, the Irishman who heard you paint houses. James Riddle Hoffa was born on February 14, 1913, in Brazil, Indiana, a small coal mining town where life was hard and futures were limited. His father, a coal miner, died when Jimmy was 7 years old. Leaving the family in desperate poverty, Jimmy's mother moved the family to Detroit, looking for better opportunities in the booming automobile industry. Detroit in the 1920s was the heart of industrial America, a city of factories and assembly lines where men could make decent wages if they were willing to work hard. Jimmy went to work young, dropping out of school after ninth grade to help support his family. He worked in grocery stores, in warehouses, anywhere he could find employment. The work was brutal. Long hours, low pay, dangerous conditions. Employers treated workers as disposable. If you complained, you were fired. If you were injured, that was your problem. There were no unions to protect you, no benefits, no job security. You worked until you couldn't work anymore, and then you starved. But Jimmy Hoffa was not a man who accepted injustice quietly. He was short, barely 5'5", but he was tough, fearless, and charismatic. He had a gift for leadership, for inspiring loyalty, for making men follow him into situations where they were outmatched and outgunned. And he had a rage against the powerful, against the bosses who exploited workers, against a system that treated human beings as expendable machinery. That rage would fuel everything Jimmy did for the rest of his life. In 1931, when he was 18 years old, Jimmy got a job with the Kroger grocery warehouse in Detroit. The work was backbreaking. Loading and unloading trucks, hauling heavy crates. Working in extreme heat and cold, the pay was miserable. And the foreman was a tyrant who fired workers on a whim. Jimmy and his co-workers decided they'd had enough. They needed a union. Unions were dangerous in 1931. Employers hated them, and they used every weapon at their disposal to destroy union organizing efforts. They hired goons to beat up organizers. They fired anyone suspected of union sympathies. They called in the police to break up strikes. Many union organizers were killed during this period. Their murders never solved. The killers never prosecuted. But Jimmy didn't care about the danger. He cared about justice, about fighting back, about making the bosses respect the workers. Jimmy organized his co-workers at the Kroger warehouse. They joined the Teamsters, a union that represented truck drivers and warehouse workers. When negotiations with management failed, Jimmy called a strike. The workers walked off the job, and Jimmy led them for several tense days. The strike continued. Management brought in strikebreakers. The police showed up. Violence erupted. But Jimmy held firm, and eventually management caved. The workers won union recognition, better wages, and improved conditions. Jimmy was 20 years old, and he just won his first major labor victory. The Teamsters brass noticed. Here was a kid with courage, intelligence, and the ability to win. They offered Jimmy a job as a business agent, essentially a union organizer who would help expand the Teamsters membership in Detroit. Jimmy accepted, and his meteoric rise began. Over the next decade, he would transform the Teamsters in Detroit from a weak, fragmented organization into one of the most powerful union locals in America. Jimmy's tactics were aggressive. When employers refused to recognize the union, Jimmy organized strikes that shut them down completely. When strikebreakers were brought in, Jimmy and his men met them with violence. Jimmy understood that respect came from strength, and strength meant you were willing to fight harder and dirtier than your opponents. He built a reputation as a man who never backed down, never compromised, and never forgot who his enemies were. But Jimmy also understood that unions needed allies. And in Detroit, in the 1940s and 1950s, those allies included organized crime, the Detroit mob, led by powerful figures with connections to the National Syndicate, controlled much of the city's illegal gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. They had power, money, and connections to corrupt politicians and police. Jimmy saw an opportunity. If the Teamsters worked with the mob instead of against them, both sides could benefit. This is where Jimmy Hoffa's story becomes complicated and where moral judgments become difficult. Was Jimmy a corrupt union leader who sold out his members to enrich himself and his mob friends? Or was he a pragmatic leader who understood that the only way to win against powerful employers was to use every weapon available, even if that meant working with criminals? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Jimmy's relationship with the Detroit mob began in the 1940s. Certain mob figures controlled the trucking industry in Detroit. They owned companies. They controlled loading docks. They had the power to make sure goods moved or didn't move. If Jimmy wanted to organize those companies, he needed the mob's permission. In exchange for that permission, Jimmy was willing to make accommodations. Mob-connected trucking companies got favorable union contracts. Mob figures were allowed to put their associates on the union payroll, and perhaps most importantly, the Teamsters Pension Fund became available for loans to mob-connected businesses. But here's what's also true. Jimmy Hoffa delivered for the workers he represented. Under his leadership, Teamsters members in Detroit got higher wages, better benefits, and improved working conditions. They got pensions, health care, and job security. They went from being powerless and exploited to being part of a powerful organization that employers feared. Jimmy fought for his members, and they loved him for it. They didn't care if he had mob connections. They cared that he got results. In 1952, Jimmy Hoffa became president of the Teamsters Joint Council in Detroit, giving him control over multiple Teamsters locals and making him one of the most powerful labor leaders in the Midwest. But his ambitions were bigger. He wanted to lead the entire International Brotherhood of Teamsters, to transform it from a collection of autonomous locals into a national powerhouse that could dictate terms to employers across America. To achieve that goal, he needed allies across the country. And that's where Russell Bufalino came in. Russell controlled Teamsters locals in Pennsylvania. Other mob figures controlled locals elsewhere. If Jimmy could forge alliances with these men, he could build the coalition he needed to win the Teamsters presidency. And so Jimmy cultivated relationships with mob bosses across America. He met with Russell Bufalino, with Santo Trafficante, with Sam Giancana in Chicago, with mobsters in New York and Los Angeles, and everywhere else the Teamsters had a presence. He promised them access to the pension fund, favorable contracts, and a blind eye to their illegal activities. In exchange, they promised him their support for the Teamsters presidency. It was Frank Sheeran who facilitated many of these meetings, particularly the ones involving Russell Bufalino. Frank would drive Jimmy to secret sit-downs, would wait outside while deals were made, would ensure that nobody interfered with the meetings. Jimmy and Frank became close during this period. Despite their different backgrounds, Jimmy the labor leader, Frank the mob enforcer, they connected. They both came from working-class backgrounds. They both understood power and how to use it. They both valued loyalty above all else. A friendship formed, and that friendship would last for more than 20 years, right up until the moment Frank pulled the trigger. In 1957, Jimmy Hoffa became president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. He was 44 years old, and he controlled a union with more than 1 million members. The Teamsters had more than $1 billion in its pension fund. Jimmy had the power to shut down the entire American transportation network with a single order. He was one of the most powerful men in America. More powerful than most senators. More powerful than most governors. Presidents had to deal with Jimmy Hoffa. Corporations had to negotiate with him. And the mob, which had helped put him in that position, expected a return on their investment. Jimmy delivered. The Teamsters pension fund became the mob's bank. Need money to build a casino in Las Vegas? The pension fund would loan it to you. No questions asked about your organized crime connections. Need to finance a real estate development or a business venture? The pension fund was there. Many of these loans were never repaid, costing the pension fund hundreds of millions of dollars. But the loans served a purpose. They gave the mob access to capital for ventures that legitimate banks wouldn't touch. And they gave Jimmy powerful allies who would protect him from his enemies. And Jimmy had enemies, plenty of them. Honest union members who saw the corruption and wanted to fight it. Journalists who investigated the Teamsters and wrote exposes. Politicians who saw the Teamsters as a corrupt organization that needed to be destroyed. And most dangerously, Robert F. Kennedy, the young, ambitious attorney general who made destroying Jimmy Hoffa his personal mission. Robert Kennedy first became interested in Jimmy Hoffa in the late 1950s. When Kennedy was chief counsel to the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management, commonly known as the McClellan Committee. The committee was investigating corruption in labor unions, and the Teamsters were a primary target. Kennedy believed that Jimmy Hoffa represented everything wrong with American labor. corruption, mob influence, and the betrayal of working people who trusted their leaders. The McClellan Committee hearings were a sensation, broadcast on television. They brought organized crime and labor corruption into American living rooms. Jimmy testified repeatedly, and the hearings became a personal battle between him and Robert Kennedy. Kennedy was relentless, asking hostile questions, presenting evidence of corruption, trying to trap Jimmy in perjury. Jimmy was defiant, refusing to back down, insulting Kennedy, claiming his constitutional rights. The two men developed a bitter hatred for each other. When John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960, he appointed his brother Robert as Attorney General. Robert Kennedy immediately made prosecuting Jimmy Hoffa and destroying the Teamsters his top priority. He created a special unit within the Justice Department, the Get Hoffa Squad, dedicated solely to investigating Hoffa and building cases against him. Kennedy was obsessed. He wanted Jimmy in prison, and he didn't care what it took to put him there. For several years, the Justice Department threw everything at Jimmy. They investigated every aspect of his life, his business dealings, his union activities. They pressured witnesses to testify against him. They offered immunity deals, threatened perjury charges, did whatever they could to build a case. Jimmy fought back with expensive lawyers, delays, appeals, and his own investigators who dug up dirt on Kennedy and other prosecutors. It was war, conducted in courtrooms and grand jury rooms and the press. Finally, in 1964, the Justice Department got what it wanted. Jimmy was convicted on two separate charges: jury tampering and fraud. The jury tampering case involved an accusation that Jimmy had attempted to bribe a juror in an earlier trial. The fraud case involved the misuse of Teamsters funds. Both convictions were controversial. Some legal scholars argued that the prosecutions were politically motivated and that the evidence was thin. But the conviction stood. Jimmy was sentenced to 13 years in federal prison. Jimmy exhausted his appeals, but by 1967, he had no options left. He entered federal prison at Lewisburg Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, still serving as Teamsters president. Still fighting, even from prison, he tried to control the union, sending messages through his lawyers, maintaining contact with mob allies, plotting his comeback. But prison changed Jimmy. It aged him, frustrated him, filled him with bitterness. And it created a vacuum at the top of the Teamsters that would have consequences nobody anticipated while Jimmy was in prison. His hand-picked successor, Frank Fitzsimmons, took over as Teamsters president. Fitzsimmons was supposed to be a caretaker, keeping the seat warm until Jimmy got out. But Fitzsimmons liked being president. He liked the power, the perks, the respect. And the mob bosses who had worked with Jimmy discovered that they liked Fitzsimmons better. He was easier to control, less volatile, more willing to let them do whatever they wanted with the pension fund. Quietly, support for Jimmy began to erode. In 1971, Jimmy Hoffa's life took an unexpected turn. President Richard Nixon, looking for Teamsters support for his 1972 re-election campaign, commuted Jimmy's sentence on the condition that he not participate in union activities until 1980. Jimmy was released from prison after serving less than 5 years. He was 58 years old, and he was free. But freedom came with a price. He couldn't legally be involved with the Teamsters, the organization that was his life's work. Jimmy couldn't accept this. He believed the Teamsters were his, that he'd built the union, that nobody else could lead it as effectively as he could. He was convinced that once he was free, the members would demand his return, that Fitzsimmons would step aside, that everything would go back to the way it was. He was wrong. The world had changed while he was in prison. The FBI had intensified its investigations into organized crime. The mob was under pressure and wanted to avoid attention. and Fitzsimmons was not going to give up power voluntarily. Jimmy began quietly working to overturn the restrictions on his union activities. He filed lawsuits arguing that the restrictions were unconstitutional. He cultivated relationships with politicians who might support him. He met with Teamsters members, hinting that he wanted to return to power. And he made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed that his old mob allies, particularly Russell Bufalino and the other bosses who had helped him become Teamsters president, would support his comeback. They didn't. Russell and the other mob bosses had worked out a comfortable arrangement with Fitzsimmons. The pension fund money flowed freely. Fitzsimmons didn't ask questions, didn't make demands, didn't attract the kind of attention that Jimmy always had. Bringing Jimmy back would mean problems. Investigations, federal heat. The mob had invested in Jimmy once, and he delivered for them. But that was the past. Now he was a liability. Russell tried to convince Jimmy to let it go, to accept his pension, to enjoy retirement. Russell was fond of Jimmy, considered him a friend. But business was business, and Jimmy was threatening business. According to Frank Sheeran's later testimony, Russell met with Jimmy multiple times in 1974 and 1975, trying to persuade him to stop his campaign to return to the Teamsters. Jimmy refused. He was stubborn, proud, convinced that he was right and everyone else was wrong. The mob leadership discussed the Jimmy Hoffa problem in a series of meetings throughout 1975. It wasn't a decision made lightly. Jimmy had powerful friends, loyal Teamsters members who would be outraged by his murder. Killing him would attract massive federal attention. The FBI would investigate relentlessly. There would be consequences, but the alternative, letting Jimmy return to power, seemed worse. Jimmy couldn't be controlled anymore. He was angry, reckless, threatening to expose mob corruption if he didn't get what he wanted. He'd become a problem that couldn't be managed through negotiation. Russell Bufalino, according to Frank Sheeran, was one of the bosses who reluctantly concluded that Jimmy had to die. Russell didn't want to kill his friend, but he couldn't see another solution. Jimmy wouldn't listen to reason. He was going to keep pushing, keep making trouble, keep threatening the comfortable arrangement the mob had with Fitzsimmons. And there was another factor. Other mob bosses wanted Jimmy dead, and if Russell opposed them, he'd be seen as weak, as putting personal friendship above the family's interests. In the mob world, that kind of weakness could get you killed. The decision was made at a meeting of mob leaders in the summer of 1975. Jimmy Hoffa would be killed. The murder had to look like a disappearance, not an assassination. There could be no body, no evidence, no witnesses, and the man who would carry out the hit was obvious. Frank Sheeran, Russell's most trusted associate, the man who had been close to Jimmy for 20 years. The man Jimmy would never suspect. Russell called Frank to his home in Pennsylvania. They sat together, and Russell explained what needed to be done. Jimmy had to go. It had been decided at the highest levels. There was no debate, no discussion. Frank's job was to get Jimmy to the place where he would be killed, and then to do the killing. Russell didn't give Frank a choice. In the mob world, orders from your boss weren't suggestions. But he did express regret. This wasn't personal. It was business. Jimmy had forced their hand. Frank accepted the assignment. Later, when he confessed to Charles Brandt, Frank would say that he felt terrible about what he had to do, that Jimmy was his friend, that he liked and admired him. But Frank had spent his entire adult life following orders, first in the army and then in the mob. He knew how to compartmentalize his feelings, how to do what needed to be done regardless of personal cost. And he knew that refusing would mean his own death. In the mob, you didn't say no to a direct order to kill someone, especially when that order came from the commission. The plan was put in motion. Frank would lure Jimmy to a meeting in Detroit. ostensibly to discuss negotiations with Tony Provenzano, a Teamsters official and New Jersey mobster with whom Jimmy had been feuding. Jimmy trusted Frank completely and would come if Frank asked him to. Once Jimmy arrived at the meeting location, he would be taken to a house where Frank would kill him. The body would then be disposed of in a way that ensured it would never be found. Simple, clean, final. July 30th, 1975 was set as the date. That Wednesday afternoon in suburban Detroit would mark the end of Jimmy Hoffa's life and the beginning of one of America's greatest mysteries. Frank Sheeran would pull the trigger, but he was just the instrument. The real killers were the system Jimmy had worked with, profited from, and ultimately threatened. The mob bosses who had elevated him to power and who now decided he had to die. The relationship between Frank Sheeran, Russell Bufalino, and Jimmy Hoffa was complex, layered, and ultimately tragic. These three men from different backgrounds, an Irish truck driver from Philadelphia, a Sicilian mob boss from Pennsylvania, and a labor leader from Detroit, formed a triangle that shaped American organized crime and labor history for 2 decades. Understanding their relationships with each other is essential to understanding what happened on July 30th, 1975. Frank first met Jimmy Hoffa in 1957 when Russell introduced them. Russell was expanding his influence within the Teamsters, and he needed someone to serve as his liaison with Jimmy. Frank was the obvious choice. He was already working for Russell. He had experience in the trucking industry, and he was someone both men could trust. The introduction took place at a restaurant in Detroit, a casual meeting that seemed unremarkable at the time, but would shape the rest of Frank's life. Jimmy and Frank clicked immediately. Despite their different positions, Jimmy was a national labor leader. Frank was a mob enforcer. They shared working-class origins and similar worldviews. They'd both come from poverty. Both fought their way to positions of power. Both understood that the world was divided between those who had power and those who didn't. They were both tough men who respected toughness in others, and they both valued loyalty, that increasingly rare quality in a world of betrayals and informants. Over the next 18 years, Frank became one of Jimmy's closest associates. He served as Jimmy's bodyguard when needed, traveling with him to meetings, standing watch while Jimmy conducted business. He served as a messenger between Jimmy and Russell, carrying information that couldn't be trusted to phones or letters. And he served as an enforcer, handling problems that required violence. When someone threatened Jimmy, Frank dealt with them. When someone needed to be intimidated, Frank intimidated them. When someone needed to disappear, Frank made them disappear. But their relationship was more than purely professional. Jimmy and Frank became genuine friends. They spent time together socially, not just on business. They attended each other's family events. Jimmy's wife, Josephine, became friendly with Frank's wife, Mary. The Hoffas and the Sheerans would have dinner together, celebrate holidays together. Jimmy confided in Frank about his fears and frustrations. Frank offered advice and support. In the brutal world they inhabited, where trust was dangerous and friendship was often fake, their bond seemed real. Frank's relationship with Russell was different, but equally deep. Russell became Frank's mentor, teaching him how to navigate the mob world, how to conduct himself, how to avoid the mistakes that got other men killed or imprisoned. Russell brought Frank into situations where he could learn, where he could observe how deals were made, how disputes were settled, how power really worked. And Russell protected Frank, ensuring that he had the support and backing of the Bufalino family. But Russell's mentorship wasn't purely altruistic. He needed Frank. Frank was his weapon, his instrument of violence, the man he used when problems couldn't be solved through negotiation or bribery. And Frank was perfect for this role because he was reliable, discreet, and effective. When Russell ordered a hit, Frank carried it out with precision. and left no evidence. When Russell needed someone intimidated, Frank intimidated them. When Russell needed muscle for a meeting, Frank provided it over the years. Frank committed numerous murders for Russell and the Bufalino family. The exact number is unclear. Frank claimed to have killed 25 people, though this number can't be verified. But what's certain is that Frank was a prolific killer. He killed union officials who threatened mob control. He killed businessmen who wouldn't pay extortion. He killed informants who might testify. He killed rival mobsters. He killed anyone Russell told him to kill. No questions asked. Frank's method was simple and effective. He preferred guns, particularly the .32 caliber pistol he used for most of his work. He planned his hits carefully, learning his target's routines. Identifying the best time and place for the kill, he established alibis, ensuring he could prove he was somewhere else when the murder occurred. And he disposed of evidence meticulously, getting rid of weapons, clothing, anything that might connect him to the crime. In more than 20 years of killing, Frank was never convicted of murder. The triangle of Sheeran, Bufalino, and Hoffa functioned smoothly for many years. Russell controlled the mob side, Jimmy controlled the Teamsters, and Frank served as the bridge between them. Money flowed from the Teamsters pension fund to mob-connected businesses. Labor peace was maintained at mob-controlled companies. The Teamsters' political power benefited the mob's interests. Everyone profited, everyone was happy. But this arrangement depended on Jimmy remaining Teamsters president and remaining cooperative with the mob. When Jimmy went to prison in 1967, the arrangement changed. Frank Fitzsimmons, who took over as Teamsters president, was easier for the mob to control. He asked fewer questions, made fewer demands, and allowed the pension fund to be used even more freely. The mob bosses, including Russell, began to prefer Fitzsimmons to Jimmy. Frank found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. He was loyal to both Russell and Jimmy, but their interests were diverging. Jimmy wanted to return to power in the Teamsters, and he expected Frank's support. Russell wanted Jimmy to stay retired, and he expected Frank to help convince Jimmy to accept retirement. Frank tried to serve both masters, but it was becoming impossible. According to Frank's later testimony to Charles Brandt, he had multiple conversations with Jimmy in 1974 and 1975, trying to convince him to let go of his Teamsters ambitions. Frank explained that the mob bosses didn't want him back, that forcing the issue would be dangerous. Jimmy wouldn't listen. He was convinced that the Teamsters membership wanted him back, that Fitzsimmons was a weak leader, that he could overcome mob opposition through political maneuvering and legal challenges. Frank also spoke with Russell, trying to find a compromise that would satisfy everyone. Maybe Jimmy could have some ceremonial role in the Teamsters. Maybe he could be a consultant. Russell was skeptical. The other mob bosses wanted Jimmy completely out of the picture, and they were losing patience with his continued campaigning. Russell told Frank that the situation was becoming dangerous, that Jimmy needed to back off before something bad happened. But Jimmy didn't back off. He filed lawsuits challenging the restrictions on his union activities. He gave interviews to newspapers, talking about his plans to return to the Teamsters. He met with Teamsters locals, building support for his comeback. He was convinced he could win, that his force of personality and his history with the union would overcome any opposition. He was wrong, and his stubbornness would cost him his life. The breaking point came in the spring of 1975. Jimmy was openly campaigning to return to the Teamsters presidency. He was talking about running in the 1976 election, about ousting Fitzsimmons, about cleaning up corruption in the union. This last point was particularly alarming to the mob. Cleaning up corruption meant investigating the pension fund loans, which meant exposing mob control of the Teamsters. Jimmy probably didn't mean it seriously, He'd been part of that corruption for decades, but his rhetoric was dangerous. It gave federal investigators ammunition and attracted exactly the kind of attention the mob wanted to avoid. The mob bosses held a series of meetings to discuss the Jimmy Hoffa problem. These meetings included representatives from multiple families: Russell Bufalino from Pennsylvania, Tony Provenzano from New Jersey, Tony Giacalone from Detroit, and others. The consensus emerged: Jimmy had to go. He couldn't be controlled, couldn't be reasoned with, and was becoming a threat to everyone's interests. The decision was referred to the Commission, the ruling body of La Cosa Nostra, which gave its approval. The murder of Jimmy Hoffa was authorized at the highest levels of the American mob. Russell was given the responsibility of organizing the hit. This made sense for several reasons. First, Russell was respected by all the families and could coordinate their cooperation. Second, Russell had the closest relationship with Jimmy and could potentially lure him to his death. Third, and most importantly, Russell had Frank Sheeran, the perfect man for the job. Frank was close to Jimmy, knew his habits and routines, and would be trusted to be alone with him, and Frank was absolutely reliable. He would follow orders no matter how difficult, and he would never talk about it afterward. Russell called Frank to Pennsylvania for a meeting. They sat in Russell's home, the same home where Frank had spent so many pleasant evenings, and Russell explained what needed to be done. The Commission had decided Jimmy had to be killed. Frank would do it. The murder would take place in Detroit, on a day when Frank could establish an alibi for being in the area for legitimate reasons. The body would be disposed of completely, leaving no evidence. It had to look like Jimmy had simply vanished. Frank later told Charles Brandt that this was the most difficult moment of his life. Jimmy was his friend, someone he'd known and worked with for nearly 20 years. Jimmy had trusted Frank, had brought him into his family's life, had treated him with respect and affection. And now Frank was being ordered to kill him. But Frank also knew that refusing was not an option. In the mob world, refusing a direct order to kill meant you would be killed yourself. And beyond that, Frank had built his entire adult life on the principle of following orders without question. He'd done it in the war. He'd done it for Russell for 20 years. He couldn't change now. Frank accepted the assignment. Russell embraced him, told him he knew how hard this was, assured him that it was necessary. They discussed the details. The murder would be set up as a meeting between Jimmy and Tony Provenzano, with whom Jimmy had been feuding. Frank would pick up Jimmy and drive him to the meeting location. Once there, other men would be waiting, and Frank would kill Jimmy with 2 shots to the head. The body would then be transported to a location where it would be disposed of permanently. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Jimmy trusted Frank completely and would get in a car with him without hesitation. The meeting with Provenzano gave Jimmy a reason to attend. He'd been trying to settle his dispute with Provenzano and would see this as an opportunity. The location, a house in Detroit, would be private and controlled, and the disposal method would ensure that no body would ever be found, which would complicate any investigation and give everyone involved plausible deniability. In the days before July 30th, Frank prepared himself mentally and practically. He obtained the gun he would use, a .32 caliber pistol. His preferred weapon. He confirmed his alibi. He would be in Detroit for a legitimate Teamsters meeting, giving him a reason to be in the area. He coordinated with the other men involved in the plot, though he was careful never to discuss details over the phone. And he tried not to think about what he was about to do, about the fact that he was going to kill one of his closest friends. Jimmy, meanwhile, had no idea what was coming. He was focused on his campaign to return to the Teamsters, convinced that he was making progress, that he would soon be back in power. He spoke with Frank regularly during this period, discussing Teamsters business, complaining about Fitzsimmons. planning his political strategy. Frank listened, offered advice, and said nothing about the plan to kill him. Years later, Frank would say that these conversations haunted him, that he felt like a traitor every time he spoke to Jimmy, knowing what was going to happen. The relationship between Sheeran, Bufalino, and Hoffa, a triangle built on mutual benefit, personal affection, and shared interests, was about to collapse into violence and betrayal. Russell had decided that his interests required Jimmy's death. Frank had decided that his loyalty to Russell outweighed his friendship with Jimmy. And Jimmy, blind to the danger, was walking straight into the trap that his friends had set for him. The triangle that had functioned so smoothly for so many years was about to be broken forever. And the breaking would happen on a hot July afternoon in suburban Detroit. Wednesday, July 30th, 1975, began as an ordinary summer day in suburban Detroit. The temperature climbed into the 80s by mid-morning. The sky was clear. People went to work, ran errands, lived their normal lives. For James Riddle Hoffa, it would be his last day on Earth. Jimmy woke that morning in his home in Lake Orion, Michigan, a comfortable house in a nice neighborhood. The kind of place a successful man could enjoy in retirement. But Jimmy wasn't enjoying retirement. He was restless, frustrated, consumed with his campaign to return to the Teamsters. He'd been up late the previous night making phone calls, talking to supporters, planning strategy. His wife, Josephine, was worried about him. He wasn't sleeping well, wasn't eating well, was driving himself hard. She'd suggested he slow down, maybe take a real vacation. But Jimmy wouldn't hear it. That morning, Jimmy told Josephine he had an important meeting scheduled for later in the day. He didn't give her details. He'd learned long ago not to discuss business with family, but he seemed excited about it. The meeting was with Tony Provenzano and Tony Giacoloni, two powerful figures in the Teamsters and the mob. Jimmy had been feuding with Provenzano, and this meeting was supposedly to resolve their differences. If Jimmy could make peace with Provenzano, it would strengthen his position within the Teamsters. This meeting mattered. What Jimmy didn't know was that the meeting was a setup, carefully orchestrated to lure him to his death. Tony Provenzano had no intention of making peace with Jimmy. In fact, Provenzano would later be able to prove he was in New Jersey at the time, nowhere near Detroit. The meeting was a fiction, bait to get Jimmy to the right place at the right time. And the man who had set up this meeting, who had convinced Jimmy it was legitimate, was Frank Sheeran. Frank had flown to Detroit the previous day, ostensibly to attend a Teamsters meeting. This gave him an alibi for being in the area and allowed him to make preparations for the murder. He'd coordinated with the other men involved in the plot. Their identities have never been definitively confirmed, though several names have been mentioned by investigators over the years. They'd selected the location for the killing, a house in northwest Detroit. Empty and private, they'd arranged for transportation and for the disposal of the body. Everything was ready, according to Frank's later confession to Charles Brandt. He picked up Jimmy around 2 p.m. on July 30th. Jimmy was waiting outside the Machu's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, where he thought the meeting with Provenzano and Giacoloni would take place. When Frank arrived, Jimmy seemed slightly annoyed. He'd been waiting about 20 minutes, and the others hadn't shown up, but not suspicious. Frank told Jimmy that the meeting location had been changed to a house nearby, that Provenzano and Giacolone were waiting there. Jimmy accepted this explanation without question and got into the car. This moment, Jimmy Hoffa getting into Frank Sheeran's car, trusting his friend completely, having no idea he was about to be killed, is one of the most poignant in the entire story. Jimmy had spent his life being paranoid about his enemies, taking precautions against assassination, surrounding himself with bodyguards, but he trusted Frank absolutely. Frank had been loyal for 20 years, had proven himself again and again. The thought that Frank might betray him never entered Jimmy's mind. They drove through suburban Detroit. Frank behind the wheel, Jimmy in the passenger seat. According to Frank's account, they talked during the drive. Jimmy complained about Fitzsimmons, about the Teamsters' leadership, about his legal battles to overturn the restrictions on his union activities. Frank listened, making sympathetic noises, feeling terrible about what he was about to do, but committed to seeing it through. The drive took perhaps 15 minutes. Though time has a way of stretching in moments like that, they arrived at the house. The exact location has never been definitively confirmed, though FBI investigators have focused on several possibilities over the years. It was an ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood, nothing that would attract attention. Frank pulled into the driveway, or perhaps parked on the street. He told Jimmy that the others were inside, waiting. Jimmy got out of the car and walked toward the house. Frank followed behind him. What happened next is based on Frank Sheeran's confession, which was never corroborated by physical evidence or other witnesses, but which most investigators believe is accurate in its essential details. Jimmy entered the house. It appeared empty. Jimmy turned to Frank, confused, asking where Provenzano and Giacolone were. And in that moment, Frank pulled out his .32 caliber pistol and shot Jimmy Hoffa twice in the head. Frank later told Charles Brandt that he aimed for the back of the head, that he wanted it to be quick and painless, that he owed Jimmy that much at least. The first shot dropped Jimmy immediately. The second shot, fired as insurance, ensured he was dead. The entire event took perhaps 5 seconds. One moment, Jimmy was alive, confused, looking for his meeting partners. The next moment, he was dead on the floor, killed by the man he trusted most. Frank said he stood there for a moment, looking down at Jimmy's body, feeling a wave of grief and guilt wash over him. But there was no time for emotions. The other men involved in the plot entered the house. Again, their identities remain uncertain, though investigators have speculated about various mob figures who were in Detroit that day. They wrapped Jimmy's body in a tarp or blanket, carried it to a vehicle, and drove away. Frank was told to leave separately, to return to his hotel, to establish his alibi. What happened to Jimmy Hoffa's body is one of the enduring mysteries of the case. Frank Sheeran gave Charles Brandt an account of what he believed happened, based on what he was told afterward, but he admitted he didn't witness the disposal firsthand. According to Frank's account, the body was taken to a mob-connected facility, possibly a funeral home, possibly a rendering plant, where it was cremated or otherwise destroyed. The destruction was so complete that no trace of Jimmy Hoffa's remains would ever be found. This explanation makes sense and fits with how the mob typically disposed of bodies when they wanted to ensure they'd never be discovered. Cremation leaves almost nothing behind, and what remains can be easily disposed of. A rendering plant, which processes animal carcasses, could also completely destroy a human body. Without a body, there's no murder weapon, no physical evidence, no way to prove a crime occurred beyond the victim's disappearance. It's the perfect murder, at least from the killer's perspective. But other theories have been proposed over the years. Some investigators believe Jimmy's body was buried in a specific location. Theories have included Giant Stadium in New Jersey, a Michigan horse farm, various construction sites around Detroit. But extensive searches of these locations have found nothing. Some theories suggest the body was placed in a car that was then crushed and smelted, destroying all evidence. Some suggest the body was weighted down and dumped in a body of water. The truth is, nobody knows for certain except the men who were involved, and most of them are now dead. What we do know is what happened after Jimmy disappeared. When he didn't return home that evening, Josephine Hoffa called the police. She told them Jimmy had gone to a meeting at the Matthew's Red Fox restaurant and hadn't come back. The police went to the restaurant and found Jimmy's car in the parking lot, locked with no signs of struggle. It was as if Jimmy had simply vanished into thin air. The FBI was called immediately. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa, former Teamsters president, mob associate, famous national figure, was big news. The investigation began within hours and would continue for decades. Agents interviewed everyone who knew Jimmy, everyone who might have information about his disappearance. They investigated his mob connections, his Teamsters enemies, anyone who might have wanted him dead. The list was long. Frank Sheeran was interviewed by the FBI multiple times over the years. He always denied any knowledge of what happened to Jimmy. He maintained that he was in Detroit for a Teamsters meeting, that he had nothing to do with Jimmy's disappearance, that he was as puzzled as everyone else. His alibi held up. He was documented as being at the Teamsters meeting, witnesses placed him there, and there was no evidence connecting him to the crime. The FBI suspected him, but suspicion isn't proof. The investigation into Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance became one of the longest and most expensive in FBI history. Agents pursued thousands of leads. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses. They searched multiple locations where the body might have been buried. They wiretapped suspects, followed them, tried to pressure them into talking. Nothing worked. The men who knew what happened to Jimmy Hoffa weren't talking, and the FBI couldn't break the case over the years. Various mobsters and mob associates were prosecuted for other crimes, and prosecutors offered them deals if they provide information about Hoffa's murder. Some men claimed to have information, but their stories often contradicted each other or couldn't be verified. Some were clearly lying, looking for reduced sentences. The one consistent thread through all the accounts was that Jimmy was killed by mob associates, probably in Detroit, and his body was disposed of completely. Beyond that, certainty was impossible. The murder of Jimmy Hoffa, if we accept that he was murdered, which seems virtually certain, was a masterpiece of mob execution. The planning was meticulous. The lure was perfect. Jimmy would never have suspected a trap at a meeting arranged by Frank. The killing was quick and clean. The disposal of the body was complete. And the conspiracy of silence held absolutely. None of the men directly involved ever testified about what they'd done. Most went to their graves without confessing. Only Frank Sheeran, old and dying, finally told the truth. And even then, his confession couldn't be corroborated with physical evidence. July 30th, 1975, was the day Jimmy Hoffa ceased to exist. Not just died. Many people die every day, but ceased to exist in a fundamental way. His body disappeared, taking with it the possibility of proof, of justice, of closure. His family was left with questions that would never be answered. His enemies achieved their goal. Jimmy was gone, permanently and completely. And Frank Sheeran, the Irishman who had painted houses for 20 years, had painted his last and most terrible house, killing the friend who had trusted him absolutely. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa sent shockwaves through American society. For days, the story dominated headlines. The former Teamsters president, the man who had been one of the most powerful labor leaders in American history, had simply vanished. The FBI launched what would become one of the largest investigations in its history. Reporters descended on Detroit, on the Maffia's Red Fox restaurant, on Jimmy's home, looking for any angle, any clue, any explanation. Josephine Hoffa held out hope that her husband was alive, that he'd been kidnapped and would be released or rescued. But as days turned to weeks, that hope faded. Friends and family began to accept the grim reality. Jimmy was almost certainly dead, murdered by the same mob associates he'd worked with for decades. The question wasn't whether he was dead, but where his body was and who exactly had killed him. The FBI investigation was massive and thorough. Special agent in charge Robert Garrity led a task force that included dozens of agents. They pursued every lead, no matter how unlikely. They interviewed everyone who knew Jimmy, from his family to his Teamsters associates to known mobsters. They wiretapped phones, surveilled suspects, analyzed Jimmy's activities in the days and weeks before his disappearance. They were looking for anything: a witness who'd seen something, a slip of the tongue by someone involved, physical evidence that could prove what happened. The Machu's Red Fox restaurant became a focal point of the investigation. Agents canvassed the area, looking for witnesses who might have seen Jimmy on July 30th. A few people came forward, saying they'd seen him in the parking lot around 2:30 p.m. Waiting, looking at his watch, seeming annoyed. But nobody had seen him get into a car or leave with anyone. It was as if he'd simply evaporated. The FBI identified several suspects relatively quickly. Tony Giacolone, the Detroit mob figure who was supposedly at the meeting with Jimmy, became a primary suspect. But Giacolone had an alibi. He was at a barbershop at the time, getting his hair cut. With witnesses to confirm it, Tony Provenzano, who was also supposedly at the meeting, was in New Jersey, nowhere near Detroit. Russell Bufalino was in Pennsylvania. All the major mob figures who might have been involved had alibis, and those alibis held up under scrutiny. Frank Sheeran was interviewed, but wasn't initially considered a top suspect. He had an alibi. He was at a Teamsters meeting in Detroit, and there was no evidence connecting him to the crime. Frank maintained his composure during FBI interviews, answering questions calmly, expressing shock and grief at Jimmy's disappearance, offering no useful information. The FBI agents who interviewed him sensed he knew more than he was saying. But sensing is improving. Without evidence, they couldn't build a case against him. The investigation expanded to include searches for Jimmy's body. Based on informant tips and investigative leads, the FBI conducted searches at multiple locations. They dug up a field in Michigan where an informant claimed the body was buried. They searched a farm in Michigan's Thumb region. They investigated claims that the body had been buried under Giants Stadium in New Jersey. Though this theory was mostly media sensationalism rather than serious investigative pursuit, every search came up empty. In December 1975, 5 months after his disappearance, Jimmy Hoffa was officially declared presumed dead by a Michigan court. His family could now settle his estate and move forward with their lives, though the questions about what happened to him would never go away. Josephine Hoffa lived until 1980, never knowing for certain what had happened to her husband, though she certainly had her suspicions. The Hoffa children, James P. Hoffa, who would later become Teamsters president himself, and Barbara Hoffa Kranzer, were left with an ambiguous grief, mourning a father whose fate was certain but unproven. The Teamsters, meanwhile, moved on quickly. Frank Fitzsimmons remained as president, and the mob's control of the union continued unchallenged. The pension fund continued to make questionable loans to mob-connected businesses. Labor racketeering continued. The Teamsters corruption, which Jimmy had been part of and had later threatened to expose, was protected by his permanent silence in a grim way. His murder accomplished exactly what the mob wanted. It eliminated a problem and sent a message to anyone else who might challenge mob control of the Teamsters. But the mob was entering a period of decline, and Jimmy Hoffa's murder was, in retrospect, a symptom of that decline. The old ways, the code of silence, the accepted corruption, the ability to kill with impunity, were becoming harder to maintain. The FBI was getting more sophisticated. The RICO Act, passed in 1970, gave prosecutors powerful new tools to go after organized crime. Wiretaps were becoming more common and more effective. And most importantly, the code of silence was breaking down. Mobsters were flipping, becoming informants. testifying against their former associates in exchange for leniency. The most dramatic example of this was the case of Jimmy the Weasel Fatiano, a high-ranking member of the Los Angeles crime family who became a government witness in 1977. Fatiano testified in multiple trials, providing detailed information about mob operations across the country. His testimony helped convict dozens of mobsters and showed that omerta was no longer absolute. If a made member like Fatiano could flip, anyone could. Russell Bufalino continued to operate his crime family through the late 1970s. But the pressure was increasing. The FBI's investigation into the Hoffa murder kept Russell under constant surveillance. His phone was tapped, his movements tracked, his associates pressured, and the FBI was building RICO cases against mob families across the country, including Russell's. In 1977, Russell was convicted of extortion and sentenced to 4 years in prison. He was 74 years old, and prison at that age was essentially a death sentence, or at least a life sentence. Russell served his time at Leavenworth Penitentiary and was released in 1981. But he wasn't done with prison. In 1982, he was convicted of conspiring to kill a witness and sentenced to 10 years. This time, he was sent to federal prison in California, far from his Pennsylvania base. His crime family continued to operate in his absence, but its power was waning. The coal mines that had provided extortion opportunities were closing. The garment factories were moving overseas. The Teamsters, under increasing federal oversight, were less available for exploitation. Frank Sheeran, meanwhile, continued to live a double life. To his family and legitimate associates, he was a retired Teamsters official, a grandfather enjoying his later years. To the mob, he was a killer who could still be called upon when needed. Frank continued to do occasional work for the Bufalino family through the 1980s. Though the opportunities for that kind of work were diminishing, the mob was under siege, and caution was the order of the day. In 1980, Frank was called to testify before a grand jury investigating labor racketeering. He invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination repeatedly, refusing to answer questions. This was standard operating procedure for mobsters and mob associates. You never talked, no matter what. But it also kept Frank under FBI scrutiny. Agents knew he'd been close to Jimmy Hoffa, knew he'd worked for Russell Bufalino, knew he'd probably been involved in criminal activities for decades. They just couldn't prove it. The 1980s saw a wave of RICO prosecutions that decimated the American mob. The commission trial in 1985 convicted the bosses of New York's 5 families on RICO charges. Similar trials took down mob leadership in Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and other cities. The FBI's strategy was working. Use RICO to charge entire organizations as criminal enterprises. Use wiretaps to gather evidence and flip lower-level members to testify against their bosses. The old ways couldn't withstand this coordinated assault. Russell Bufalino was released from prison in 1989. Aged 86, his health failing, he returned to Pennsylvania, to the modest house he'd lived in for decades, and tried to enjoy what little time he had left. But he was a broken man, his power gone, his family decimated by prosecutions, his world transformed beyond recognition. The mob he'd known, the mob of respect and honor, and keeping your mouth shut, had been replaced by something ugly. Informants cutting deals, bosses turning on each other. The code of silence shattered. Russell died on February 25, 1994. In a nursing home in Pennsylvania, he was 90 years old. His obituaries described him as a businessman who had been convicted of various crimes, but made no mention of his true role in American organized crime. His funeral was attended by family and a few old friends, but not the crowds that would have turned out in his heyday. The FBI agents who had pursued him for decades probably felt a sense of closure. though Russell had never been convicted for the crime that defined his legacy, ordering the murder of Jimmy Hoffa. Frank Sheeran attended Russell's funeral. One of the few remaining links to the old days. Frank was 73 years old, and his own health was declining. He'd been diagnosed with cancer, and the prognosis wasn't good. He was facing his own mortality, and with it came the weight of his secrets. He'd killed more than 24 people, including his friend Jimmy Hoffa. He'd lived his entire adult life following a code that demanded silence. But now, approaching the end, he felt the need to talk, to explain, to confess. The investigation into Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance never officially closed. The FBI continued to pursue leads, though they became less frequent as years passed. Various theories were proposed and investigated. In 2006, the FBI searched a farm in Michigan based on a tip that turned out to be false. In 2013, they searched beneath a driveway in suburban Detroit, again finding nothing. Every few years, a new theory would emerge, generate headlines, and lead nowhere. The impact of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance extended beyond the immediate investigation. It became a cultural touchstone, a symbol of mob power and the limits of law enforcement. Books were written about the case. Documentaries were produced. Hoffa's name became synonymous with unsolved mysteries and mob hits. The question, "What happened to Jimmy Hoffa?" became part of American folklore, asked in jest, but rooted in genuine curiosity. The Teamsters, meanwhile, underwent significant reforms. Federal oversight increased, and efforts were made to remove mob influence from the union. James P. Hoffa, Jimmy's son, was elected Teamsters president in 1998. A bitter irony given what had happened to his father. The younger Hoffa worked to clean up the union's image and restore its credibility. Though the Teamsters' reputation never fully recovered from the decades of corruption. For Frank Sheeran, the aftermath of Jimmy Hoffa's murder was a long, slow descent into isolation and regret. He'd done what he'd been ordered to do, had followed the code he'd lived by, had kept his mouth shut for decades, but the cost had been enormous. He'd lost his friend, he'd lost his innocence. If he'd ever had any, he'd lost the respect of a society that might have admired his wartime service, but would revile him for his crimes. And he'd lost any hope of peace in his final years. As the memories of what he'd done haunted him, the world had changed. The mob that Frank had served was dying. The code that had governed his life was meaningless in a world where everyone flipped, where loyalty was a liability, where the only thing that mattered was saving yourself. Frank had been loyal to the end, and what had it gotten him? His boss was dead. His crime family was decimated. His friend was murdered by his own hand. The only thing left was the truth. And finally, Frank decided to tell it. In the late 1990s, Frank Sheeran was an old man dying of cancer in a nursing home in Philadelphia. He was 78 years old, and his body was failing. The cancer was spreading. The treatments weren't working, and his doctors had told him he didn't have much time left. For most of his life, Frank had been a man of action. A soldier, a truck driver, an enforcer, a killer. Now he was helpless, confined to a bed, dependent on nurses for basic care. And in his helplessness, something shifted. The secrets he'd carried for decades began to feel like a burden he no longer wanted to bear. Charles Brett was a former prosecutor and homicide investigator turned medical malpractice attorney. He had experience with criminals, understood how they thought, and knew how to interview them. In 1991, Brandt was introduced to Frank Sheeran through mutual acquaintances who knew Frank from his Teamsters days. Brandt was representing Frank on a minor legal matter, and during their conversations, he began to sense that Frank had stories to tell. Important stories, stories that had never been told before. At first, Frank was guarded. He'd spent his entire life keeping secrets, and the habit of silence was deeply ingrained. But Brant was patient. He didn't push, didn't pressure. Just listened when Frank wanted to talk, and left him alone when he didn't. Gradually, over months and years, Frank began to open up. He told Brant about his experiences in World War II, about his work as a truck driver, about his introduction to Russell Bufalino and the mob. But he still wouldn't talk about the murders. Wouldn't admit to the crimes that had defined his life. The breakthrough came in 2000. When Frank's health had deteriorated significantly, he knew he was dying, and the Catholic faith of his childhood was reasserting itself. Frank had stopped going to church decades ago. How could a man who'd killed more than 24 people take communion? But now, facing death, he wanted absolution. He wanted to confess his sins, not just to a priest, but to the world. He wanted people to know what he'd done, why he'd done it, and what it had cost him. Frank told Brant that he was ready to tell the whole story. He would confess to every murder he'd committed, including the murder of Jimmy Hoffa, but he had conditions. First, the confessions would not be made public until after his death. He didn't want to spend his final days dealing with media attention or FBI harassment. Second, Brant would write a book about Frank's life, telling his story in full, giving context and explanation to the crimes. Third, any money from the book would go to Frank's family, who had suffered financially because of his criminal career. Brant agreed to these conditions, and the interviews began in earnest. Over the next 3 years, Frank talked for hundreds of hours, telling Brant everything. He described his childhood, his war experiences, his entry into the mob. He confessed to murders, providing details that only the killer would know. The weapons used, the locations, the reasons, the aftermath. He explained the structure and operations of the Bufalino crime family. And finally, he told Brant about July 30th, 1975, and what really happened to Jimmy Hoffa. Frank's confession about the Hoffa murder was detailed and specific. He described how Russell Bufalino had ordered the hit, how the plan was developed, how Frank had picked up Jimmy at the Mauchu's Red Fox, driven him to the house, and killed him with 2 shots to the head. He described his feelings during and after the murder, the guilt, the grief, the sense that he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. He explained what he believed had happened to the body, though he admitted he hadn't witnessed the disposal firsthand. Brant was struck by Frank's demeanor during these confessions. Frank wasn't boastful or proud of what he'd done. He didn't glorify the violence or present himself as tough or fearless. Instead, he seemed haunted, burdened, desperate to explain himself. Frank maintained that he'd always followed orders, that he'd done what was necessary, that he'd lived by a code that demanded loyalty above all else. But he also seemed to understand that this code had required him to commit terrible acts, and he struggled with the moral weight of those acts. The question that Brant and later investigators would wrestle with was, should we believe Frank Sheeran? He was a career criminal, an admitted liar, someone who had deceived people for decades. He had every reason to lie, to inflate his importance, to settle old scores, to create a legacy beyond just being another mob enforcer. On the other hand, many details of his confession checked out when investigated. He knew things about the Bufalino crime family that only an insider would know. His timeline for the Hoffa murder matched what investigators had pieced together, and crucially, he had no obvious reason to falsely confess to Hoffa's murder. He wasn't cutting a deal or seeking leniency. He was dying and beyond prosecution. Several pieces of corroborating evidence supported Frank's account. FBI agents investigating the Hoffa case had always suspected that someone close to Jimmy, someone he trusted completely, had been involved in the murder. Frank fit that profile perfectly. Forensic investigators later examined the house where Frank claimed to have killed Hoffa and found evidence, though not conclusive proof, consistent with his account. and other mobsters and mob associates interviewed over the years had suggested that Frank Sheeran was indeed involved in the Hoffa hit, though they didn't provide details, but there were also skeptics. Some FBI agents who had worked the Hoffa case for years believed that Frank was exaggerating his role, or even fabricating it entirely. They pointed out that Frank couldn't provide certain details, like exactly where Hoffa's body was disposed of. They noted that no physical evidence, no gun, no bloodstains, no forensic proof, had ever been found to support his confession, and they suggested that Frank might have confessed for the publicity, for the book deal, for the desire to be remembered as important. Charles Brandt became convinced that Frank was telling the truth, at least in its essential elements. He believed that Frank had indeed killed Jimmy Hoffa on orders from Russell Bufalino, that the murder had happened essentially as Frank described, and that Frank's confession was a genuine attempt to unburden himself before death. Brandt spent years investigating Frank's claims, interviewing other sources, reviewing FBI files, and checking facts. While he couldn't prove every detail, he found enough corroboration to believe the core story was accurate. The result of Brandt's work was published in 2004 as I Heard You Paint Houses, Frank the Irishman, Sheeran Enclosing the Case on Jimmy Hoffa. The title came from Russell Bufalino's first words to Frank Sheeran when they met. I heard you paint houses, mob slang for I heard you kill people. The blood from a shooting supposedly resembled paint on the walls and floor. Hence, Painting Houses, the book was a sensation, generating headlines and renewing interest in the Hoffa case. Frank Sheeran died on December 14, 2003. In a nursing home in Pennsylvania, he was 83 years old. His death came before Brandt's book was published, so Frank never saw the public reaction to his confessions. His obituaries noted that he had been a Teamsters official and had claimed to have killed Jimmy Hoffa, but they were brief and didn't capture the full scope of his life. He was buried quietly, attended by family and a few old friends. A man whose secrets had finally been told, but who remained enigmatic to the end. The FBI's response to Frank's confession was measured. Officially, they said the confession was under investigation and that they were reviewing it for accuracy. Unofficially, many agents believed Frank had indeed killed Hoffa, but were frustrated that his confession couldn't lead to prosecutions. Frank was dead. Russell was dead. Most of the other men involved were dead. There was nobody left to charge, nobody to convict. The case remained officially unsolved, even as most people involved came to believe it had been solved. In the years since Frank's death, his confession has been scrutinized, debated, and analyzed. Academic researchers have studied it, journalists have investigated it, and law enforcement has attempted to verify it. The consensus among experts seems to be that Frank was probably telling the truth about the broad outlines. He was involved in Hoffa's murder. It happened in Detroit. It was ordered by mob leadership, but that some details may be inaccurate or embellished. Memory is fallible, especially over decades, and Frank may have confused or conflated certain details. The most significant gap in Frank's confession is the exact location of Hoffa's body. Frank said he believed the body was cremated or rendered, but he admitted he didn't know for certain. This has frustrated investigators and Hoffa's family, who desperately want closure. Without a body, there can be no funeral, no grave to visit, no physical proof of what happened. Jimmy Hoffa remains officially missing, not confirmed dead, even though everyone involved knows the truth. Frank's confession also provided insights into the broader world of La Cosa Nostra during its height. His descriptions of how the mob operated, how decisions were made, how violence was employed, and how the code of silence was maintained gave investigators and historians valuable information. Frank had been present at important meetings, had witnessed significant events, and had participated in the mob's evolution from the 1950s through the 1990s. His testimony, even posthumously, helped fill gaps in the historical record. But perhaps the most important aspect of Frank's confession was its human dimension. This was not just a story about crime and violence. It was a story about loyalty and betrayal, about following orders and living with consequences, about friendship destroyed by necessity. Frank's confession revealed a man tortured by what he'd done, unable to escape the memories of the people he'd killed, particularly Jimmy Hoffa. In his final conversations with Brandt, Frank returned again and again to that July day in 1975, to the moment he raised his gun and shot his friend. That moment defined Frank's life more than any other, and he carried its weight until his death. The question of forgiveness haunted Frank's final years. Could a man who'd killed more than 24 people be forgiven? Frank wanted to believe in forgiveness, in redemption, in the possibility that his confession and regret might count for something. He had priests visit him in the nursing home, and he confessed his sins to them, seeking absolution. But he also seemed to understand that some acts can't be forgiven, that some moral lines once crossed can never be uncrossed. He'd painted houses for 20 years, and the blood on his hands would never wash clean. Charles Brandt's book ended with Frank's death, but the story didn't end there. Frank's confession would inspire investigations, debates, and eventually a major motion picture. His words would be scrutinized by experts and challenged by skeptics. His motivations would be questioned and his character analyzed, but through it all, one thing remained clear. Frank Sheeran had lived a life that few people could imagine, had done things that most people would find incomprehensible, and had finally told the truth about what he'd done and what it had cost him. Whether that truth brings justice or simply adds another layer to an already complex story remains a question without a definitive answer. In 2004, the same year Charles Brandt's book I Heard You Paint Houses was published, veteran Hollywood producer Art Linson acquired the film rights. Linson saw immediately that the book had the elements of a great movie. A fascinating true story, complex characters, moral ambiguity, and a window into a world most people never see. But turning the book into a film would prove to be a complicated process that would take 15 years. The obvious choice to direct was Martin Scorsese, who had spent decades making films about organized crime, masculinity, violence, and the American underworld. Scorsese had directed Mean Streets, Goodfellas, and Casino, films that had defined how mob stories were told on screen. He understood the world of Via Cosa Nostra, understood its codes and contradictions, understood how to portray violence without glorifying it. And he was interested in telling the story of Frank Sheeran, Jimmy Hoffa, and Russell Bufalino. Scorsese's interest in the project was also personal. He was in his 60s when he first read Brandt's book, and he saw it as an opportunity to explore themes that had become increasingly important to him: aging, regret, mortality, and the consequences of a life built on violence. This wouldn't be Goodfellas Part 2. This would be something darker, more contemplative, more focused on what happens after the violence, after the power, when you're old and alone with your memories and your sins. The casting was inspired. Robert De Niro would play Frank Sheeran, reuniting with Scorsese for the 9th time and taking on a role that would allow him to explore a character across decades. Al Pacino would play Jimmy Hoffa, his first collaboration with Scorsese, and an opportunity to portray one of the most famous figures in American labor history. And Joe Pesci, who had retired from acting, was convinced to return for the role of Russell Bufalino, bringing his particular intensity to the character of the Quiet Dome. But there was a technical challenge. The story of the Irishman spans decades, from the 1950s to the early 2000s. The actors, De Niro, Pacino, and Pesci, were all in their 70s. How could they convincingly portray younger versions of their characters? Scorsese's solution was groundbreaking. Digital de-aging technology that would make the actors appear 30, 40, even 50 years younger in certain scenes. It was expensive and technically complex, but it allowed Scorsese to tell the story with the same actors throughout, maintaining consistency and allowing for subtle aging across the decades. The script, written by Steven Zaillian, stayed largely faithful to Brandt's book while making necessary adaptations for cinema. The film would tell Frank's story in non-linear fashion, jumping between different time periods, building toward the central event of Jimmy Hoffa's murder. Scorsese was interested in the contrast between Frank's younger self, confident, capable, violent, and his older self, diminished, alone, regretful. The film would be a meditation on what it means to live a life of violence and loyalty. And what remains when that life is over? Production began in 2017, with filming taking place in New York and other locations that could stand in for the various settings the story required. Scorsese worked meticulously to recreate the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, paying attention to period details, clothing, cars, locations, music that would transport audiences to these eras. The de-aging technology required special cameras and lighting setups, making the production technically complex and expensive. The budget ballooned to over $160 million, making it one of the most expensive films Scorsese had ever directed. Netflix, looking to establish itself as a major player in prestige filmmaking, agreed to finance and distribute the film. This was controversial. Some cinema purists argued that a Scorsese film should have a traditional theatrical release, but it also meant the film could be made without studio interference and with the creative freedom Scorsese demanded. The film would receive a limited theatrical release, followed by streaming availability on Netflix, giving it access to a massive global audience. The Irishman premiered at the New York Film Festival in September 2019 to rapturous acclaim. Critics praised Scorsese's direction, the performances by De Niro, Pacino, and Pesci, and the film's ambitious scope and contemplative tone. The film was 3.5 hours long. Scorsese had refused to cut it down, and it required patience and attention from viewers. But for those willing to invest the time, it offered a rich, complex, and ultimately devastating portrait of men whose lives had been defined by violence and who now faced the consequences. The film's portrayal of the Hoffa murder largely followed Frank Sheeran's confession, as reported in Brandt's book. We see Frank picking up Jimmy, driving him to the house, and shooting him twice. The scene is stark and brutal, with no music, no dramatic flourishes. It's presented matter-of-factly, almost clinically, emphasizing the banality of the act. Scorsese doesn't glamorize the violence. He shows it as what it was. One man killing another man, a friend killing a friend. A terrible act committed because orders were given and had to be followed. What sets The Irishman apart from Scorsese's earlier mob films is its focus on aftermath and consequences. The final act of the film shows Frank as an old man in a nursing home, abandoned by his family, his friends dead, his world gone. He's visited occasionally by a priest and by FBI agents still trying to solve the Hoffa case. But mostly he's alone. In one of the film's most powerful scenes, Frank asks the priest about forgiveness, about whether his sins can be absolved. The priest offers some comfort, but the film suggests that some acts place you beyond redemption. The film also explores the human cost of Frank's choices. His relationship with his daughter Peggy, played by Anna Paquin in a mostly silent but powerful performance, is destroyed by his involvement in Hoffa's murder. Peggy had been close to Jimmy. He was like an uncle to her, and when he disappeared, she knew her father was involved. She never confronts Frank directly, but she withdraws from him completely. refusing to speak to him, refusing to visit him in his final years. This rejection haunts Frank more than anything else, more than the murders, more than the prison time, more than the loss of friends. He dies alone, and his daughter's absence is the final judgment on his life. Scorsese's visual approach to the material was deliberately different from his earlier mob films. Goodfellas had been energetic, dynamic, filled with camera movement and music and life. The Irishman is more static, more contemplative. The camera observes rather than celebrates. The pacing is slower, giving weight to moments of silence and reflection. The color palette is muted, reflecting the emotional tone of regret and loss. Scorsese was making a film about the end of things, the end of the mob era, the end of these men's lives, the end of a certain American story. The film's accuracy as a historical document has been debated. Some critics and investigators have argued that the film presents Frank Sheeran's confession as definitive truth. When it remains unproven, they point out that no body was ever found, that no physical evidence corroborates Frank's account, and that other theories about Hoffa's murder exist. The film's subtitle, A Martin Scorsese Picture, perhaps acknowledges this. It's not presenting itself as documentary truth, but as Scorsese's interpretation of the story, based on Brandt's book and Frank's confession. What the film gets undeniably right is the atmosphere and texture of the mob world during the period it covers. The details of how the mob operated, how violence was employed, how loyalty was demanded and betrayed. All of this feels authentic. Scorsese, working with consultants who had experience in law enforcement and organized crime investigation, recreated the world of the 1950s through 1980s mob with meticulous attention to detail. The film also accurately portrays the relationship between organized crime and organized labor during this period. The Teamsters' corruption, the pension fund loans, the mob's control over union locals. All of this is historically accurate. Jimmy Hoffa's relationship with the mob, his prosecution by Robert Kennedy, his imprisonment and release, his attempt to regain power. The film presents these events accurately, even as it takes dramatic license in specific scenes and dialogue. The performances by the three leads were widely praised. De Niro brought depth and complexity to Frank Sheeran, portraying him as a man who lived by a code, but gradually came to question that code. Pacino's Jimmy Hoffa was charismatic, volatile, and tragic, a man whose strengths became his fatal flaws. And Pesci's Russell Bufalino was a revelation, playing the character with quiet menace and weary wisdom. A man who had seen everything and survived by being smarter and more patient than his rivals. The Irishman received 10 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Supporting Actor for Pacino and Pesci. It didn't win in any category. Parasite swept the major awards that year, but the nominations affirmed the film's critical success and cultural impact. More importantly, the film brought renewed attention to the Jimmy Hoffa case, to Frank Sheeran's confession, and to the broader story of organized crime in mid-20th century America. For audiences who knew nothing about Frank Sheeran, Russell Bufalino, or the details of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, the film served as an introduction to a fascinating and tragic American story. For those already familiar with the case, the film offered Scorsese's masterful interpretation, bringing these real people to life through the performances of some of cinema's greatest actors. And for everyone, the film offered something rare in modern cinema: a meditation on aging, regret, mortality, and the price of loyalty. The film ends with Frank alone in his nursing home room, the door left slightly ajar as he'd requested. A small gesture of hope that someone, his daughter, a friend, anyone, might visit, but we know nobody will. The screen fades to black, and the story ends as it had to end, with loneliness, silence, and the weight of a life that can never be undone. It's a devastating conclusion, but also an honest one. Scorsese doesn't offer redemption or forgiveness. He simply shows us what remains when everything else is gone. Memory, regret, and the inescapable fact of what was done. The story of Frank Sheeran, Russell Bufalino, and Jimmy Hoffa is uniquely American. It's a story about power, how it's gained, how it's used, and how it corrupts. It's a story about loyalty, to friends, to bosses, to codes of conduct that demand everything and promise nothing. And it's a story about the price we pay for our choices, especially the choices we can never take back. These three men came from working-class backgrounds, from immigrant communities where success was hard-won and security was never guaranteed. They rose to positions of power through intelligence, ruthlessness, and a willingness to break rules that others followed. Frank became a feared mob enforcer. Russell became a powerful don who sat on the commission. Jimmy became the president of America's largest and most powerful union. By conventional measures, they were all successful. But success in their world came with terrible costs. Frank spent his life killing people on orders, destroying families, spreading violence and fear. He made good money, had powerful friends, and commanded respect, but he also lived in constant danger, always looking over his shoulder, always one betrayal away from death or prison. And in the end, he died alone, abandoned by his daughter, haunted by memories of the people he'd killed. Russell built a criminal empire that made him wealthy and powerful. He controlled politicians, judges, and union officials. He influenced decisions that affected thousands of workers and millions of dollars. But he spent years in prison, watched his empire crumble, and died knowing that his life's work had been dismantled by federal prosecutors and informants who violated the code he'd lived by. Jimmy built the Teamsters into a powerhouse that improved the lives of hundreds of thousands of working people. Under his leadership, Teamsters members got better wages, benefits, and working conditions. He genuinely fought for workers, even as he enriched himself and cooperated with organized crime. But his ambition and his inability to let go of power cost him his life. He was murdered by the same people who had helped him rise to power, killed by a friend he trusted completely. The human cost of their choices extended far beyond their own lives. Frank's daughter Peggy lost her father to a world she couldn't understand or forgive. Jimmy's wife Josephine spent the last years of her life wondering what had happened to her husband. Russell's family watched him spend his final years in prison, his legacy destroyed, and beyond the immediate families, there were the victims, the people Frank killed, the workers whose pension money was stolen, the communities damaged by mob corruption. The story also tells us something about American institutions in the mid-20th century. The Teamsters, which should have been a force for worker empowerment, was corrupted from within by mob influence. Law enforcement, which should have protected citizens, was often complicit or incompetent. Politicians, who should have served the public interest, were bought and sold. The system was broken, and men like Frank, Russell, and Jimmy exploited that brokenness for their own benefit. But the system eventually fought back. The RICO Act, an aggressive federal prosecution, dismantled much of the American mob's power. The Teamsters underwent reforms that reduced corruption. Law enforcement got better at investigating organized crime, using new technologies and techniques to penetrate organizations that had once seemed impervious. The old ways, the code of silence, the acceptance of corruption, the ability to kill with impunity, became untenable. By the time Frank Sheeran died in 2003, the world he'd known was gone. The mob families he'd worked with had been decimated by prosecutions. The code of omerta had been shattered by informants. The Teamsters had been reformed. The casual corruption that had defined mid-century America had been challenged. If not eliminated, Frank was a relic, a survivor from an era that had ended. Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance remains one of the enduring mysteries of American history. But the mystery is less about what happened. Most experts believe Frank Sheeran's confession is essentially accurate, and more about why we remain fascinated by it. Perhaps it's because the story captures something essential about power and its consequences. Jimmy had power. He abused it, and it destroyed him. Frank had power. He used it to kill, and it left him alone and haunted. Russell had power. He wielded it carefully, and it still wasn't enough to save him. Or perhaps we're fascinated because the story is so human. These weren't cartoon villains or monsters. They were men with families, with friends, with moments of kindness and decency mixed in with their violence and corruption. Frank loved his daughters even as his choices drove them away. Jimmy genuinely cared about working people even as he stole from them. Russell was capable of friendship and loyalty even as he ordered murders. Their complexity makes them more interesting and more tragic than simple villains would be. The final image that stays with us is Frank Sheeran alone in that nursing home. The door left ajar, waiting for a visitor who will never come. It's an image of complete isolation, of a man who lived his entire life in the company of dangerous men, who valued loyalty above all else, who followed orders without question. Now abandoned by everyone, his mob friends are dead. His family has rejected him. He has his memories. And those memories are terrible. Did Frank feel regret? Charles Brandt believed he did. Based on their conversations, Frank talked about the people he'd killed, especially Jimmy, with what seemed like genuine remorse. He sought forgiveness from priests, from God, perhaps from himself. But regret doesn't erase what was done. The people Frank killed remained dead. The families he destroyed remained broken. Regret might have made Frank's final years more bearable, but it didn't constitute justice or redemption. The question of justice haunts this story. Jimmy Hoffa's killers were never prosecuted. Frank Sheeran died a free man, never charged with the murder he confessed to. Russell Bufalino was convicted of other crimes, but never for ordering Hoffa's death. The law failed to bring these men to account for their worst crimes. Does Frank's confession and his suffering in his final years constitute a kind of justice? Or is it simply the natural consequence of a life lived in violence? You end up alone, haunted, and broken? There are no easy answers, which is perhaps why this story continues to resonate. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, loyalty, and the American dream. Frank, Russell, and Jimmy all achieved versions of success. They rose from poverty to positions of influence. They lived lives that most people would consider impossible, but they also paid prices that most people would find unacceptable. They traded their souls, if we believe in souls, for power and money that ultimately meant nothing. In the end, this story is a tragedy in the classical sense. These men were brought down, not by outside forces, but by their own character flaws and the inevitable consequences of their choices. Frank's fatal flaw was his unquestioning loyalty. He followed orders even when those orders required him to kill his friend. Russell's fatal flaw was his cold pragmatism. He could order Jimmy's death because business required it, but he lost his humanity in the process. Jimmy's fatal flaw was his pride and his inability to accept defeat. He couldn't let go of the Teamsters, and that stubborn refusal to accept reality cost him his life. The story of the Irishman is also a story about America itself. Ambitious, violent, corrupt, and ultimately self-correcting. The mob era represented a period when America's institutions were weak enough to be captured by criminal organizations. But those institutions eventually grew stronger, fought back, and largely prevailed. The mob still exists, but it's a shadow of what it once was. The Teamsters still exist, but they're more honest than they were in Jimmy's era. Law enforcement is more effective than it was when Frank was painting houses. Progress, such as it is, came at enormous cost. Thousands of people were killed in mob violence. Billions of dollars were stolen from pension funds and workers. Communities were damaged by corruption and organized crime. And individual lives, like Frank's, like Jimmy's, like those of their families, were destroyed. The price of moving from the corrupt mid-century to a somewhat less corrupt present was paid in blood and broken lives. As we reflect on this story, we should remember that these events really happened. Frank Sheeran really killed people. Jimmy Hoffa really disappeared. Russell Bufalino really ordered murders from his modest home in Pennsylvania. This isn't fiction, isn't Hollywood invention. These were real men who lived real lives and made real choices that had real consequences. Understanding their story helps us understand a crucial period of American history. When organized crime reached its peak and began its decline, we should also remember the victims. The people Frank killed had families who mourned them. The Teamsters members whose pension money was stolen deserved better from their union leadership. Jimmy Hoffa's family deserved to know what happened to him, to bury his body, to have closure. In focusing on the fascinating lives of Frank, Russell, and Jimmy, we risked forgetting the people who suffered because of their actions. But we should also recognize the humanity in these men. Flawed and criminal as they weren't born killers or gangsters. They were shaped by circumstances, by poverty, by war, by a system that rewarded violence and punished weakness. In different circumstances, Frank might have been just a truck driver, Russell just a businessman, Jimmy just a labor leader. Their potential for good was corrupted by the world they inhabited and the choices they made within that world. The haunting final image of Frank alone in his nursing home reminds us that we all die alone, that we all face judgment for our actions, and that we all carry the weight of our choices to the grave. Frank carried a heavier weight than most, the weight of 25 murders, including that of his friend. Whether his confession and regret constitute redemption is a question each person must answer for themselves. But his story serves as a warning. A life built on violence, no matter how loyal or professional, ends in isolation and regret. Sleep well. And thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most fascinating and tragic stories in American crime history. Thank you for staying with us through this incredible true story. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the real gangsters who inspired The Irishman, please subscribe to our channel for more long-form true crime and historical documentaries. We bring you the stories behind the headlines, the truth behind the myths, and the human drama that shapes history. Hit the like button if this exploration kept you engaged, and share it with anyone fascinated by real mob history, by the Teamsters, or by unsolved mysteries that have haunted America for decades. Your support helps us continue creating these in-depth investigations into the stories that matter. Drop a comment below. Do you believe Frank Sheeran's confession? What do you think really happened to Jimmy Hoffa? After hearing this full account, do you see these men as villains, as victims of their circumstances, or as something more complex? We want to hear your thoughts. If you're interested in more stories like this, check out our other documentaries on organized crime in America, on labor history, on unsolved mysteries, and on the intersection of crime and politics that has shaped our nation. We have deep dives into the 5 families of New York, the Chicago outfit, the history of the FBI's war on organized crime, and much more, the story of Frank Sheeran. Russell Bufalino and Jimmy Hoffa is a uniquely American tragedy, a story of ambition, loyalty, violence, and regret that continues to fascinate us nearly 50 years after Jimmy walked into that parking lot and disappeared. It's a story that asks difficult questions about power, about justice, about the choices we make, and the prices we pay. Thank you for watching, for listening, for engaging with this complex and troubling history. May you find in this story whatever truth you're seeking, and may you learn from the mistakes of men who paid the ultimate price for lives built on violence and corruption. Sleep well, friends, and remember, the door is left ajar. But some visitors never come. Some choices can never be undone. Some sins can never be forgiven. But understanding the past, understanding these men and their world, helps us build a better future. We'll see you in the next story. Good night.